first time, the Yud Gimel Ikrei Hamuna, the 13 principles of faith of Maimonides. So Maimonides writes in his magnum opus, the Yad HaChazaka, that these principles, if you don't believe in them, you have no place in the world to come. So pretty intense. And last week we discussed in deep detail how exactly that's possible. How you could have a person, we'll call her Sandy, who is a Mother Teresa-like figure, perfect, wonderful, does everything right, and yet she doesn't believe in the 13 principles of faith, which include that there's a God, and he gave us the Torah, and et cetera, and she has no place in the world to come. And then you have Moishi, right? You have Moishi, who is a person who believes in the 13 principles, but he's not such a great fellow. We said last week, right, about Moishi, that he cheats on his taxes, he goes to work, and on his way he kicks squirrels, okay? Does all sorts of nasty things, but he believes in the 13 principles of faith, and therefore he has a place in the world to come. Of course, he's going to have to suffer for all the bad things he does as well, and his place in the world to come is going to be in the nosebleeds. He's going to be sitting high up there in the estadium. He's not going to have much of a good view at all, but he'll have a place. Doesn't seem fair. How is it possible? How is it possible at all that our good lady doesn't have a place in the world to come, and Moishi, who believes in the 13 principles but not such a great guy, has a place in the world to come? And last week we spent around an hour explaining the concept that it's not that Moishi is a better person than this lady. I can't remember. What was her name? Sandy? Let's call her Sandy. In fact, Moishi's definitely not a better person than Sandy. But whereas Sandy is living an earthly life, Moishi has at least tapped into, at least on a very basic level, on the belief level, which is not much, but at least it's a beginning, he's tapped into the concept of a transcendent life. That means to say that Sandy, she's content to be a good person in this world, to make a difference, and then she'll die in this world. She has no problem with that. And she'll tell you, I have no problem not going to the world to come because I don't believe in it. So that's that. Now, Moishi does his handful of mitzvahs throughout his life. You know, once in a while he gives money to a charity when he gets guilted into it. And once in a while he pets his son. Good boy. Okay? And so, okay. So he gets rewarded for some of the good deeds that he does, and the bad deeds that he does, of course, he has to get punished. But he's playing the game. He's living a transcendent life. We explained last week that the world to come is less of a reality and more of your own creation. If you create it, you have it. And what is the world to come? The deeper teachings say that in Judaism, you know what the world to come is? It's not this place of candy and treats and donuts that you get to chomp on, and chocolate rabbits jumping by, marshmallow rainbow from Passover. We all eat those. That's not what it is. What it is the relationship that you've created with God. You work your whole life to create a relationship with God, but you can't fully consummate. You're engaged. You get to have a relationship with God, but you can't fully consummate it till you're... The world to come is where you get to fully engage in the experience of having a relationship with God. In its fullness. It's the intimacy once you get married. That's what it is. And so if you spend your life and you believe in God, and you try to develop a relationship with God, then you have a place in the world to come. Because the place in the world to come is nothing but the relationship that you have cultivated on this earthly world. That's it. That's what it is. I don't mean to say that's it, that it's not great. It's just that's what it is. You could be a great person in this world, but you've never cultivated a relationship with God, either because you didn't care about it or you didn't believe in Him. It makes no difference. It's a cause and effect. If you don't believe in God, you don't cultivate a relationship with Him, there is no world to come, because the world to come is just the relationship that you have developed. It's a place where you get to consummate the relationship that you have developed. And so that's what we explained last week. So we can think about it a little different, that it's not that Sandy's being punished. You didn't believe in God, so you have no place in the world to come. That's not it at all. It's just it's cause and effect. The world to come is the place where you experience the fullness of your relationship you've created in this world. And if you never created it, it's not there. Moishi's going to have a place in the world to come, very, very small. And he'll have to go through the pain of suffering for all his bad deeds as well. But at least he's in the game. He's in the world to come game. So that's what we explained last week. Did you have a question, Linda?
Oh, that's okay.
Okay. Sabrina asked a very interesting question this week. I got a great email with 2 questions based on the class, which I like for 2 reasons. Number 1, they're great questions, and number 2, that means she listened to the class. Okay, right? You did, okay. And she asked 2 very, very important questions. And it got me really thinking, and I said, you know what? I've got to deal with those questions in this class. I've got to deal with those questions. The first question is, okay, I get it, Rabbi. The people that believe in the 13 principles have a place in the world to come. We don't know where. We don't know. Are they going to be on the 50-yard line, right in the center? Are they going to be in the nosebleeds, like up high, and they can barely see anything? We don't know where they're going to be, but they're gonna have a place. And we know that the people that don't believe in the 13 principles, any of them, or certainly, well, let's talk about belief in God, because that's the easiest to put our head around. They don't have a place in the world to come. Not as a punishment, just cause and effect. You never developed a relationship with God. It's not there for you when you die. That's it. But what about someone who's not sure? Very, very good question. What about someone who's not sure? They don't not want to believe in God. They just aren't sure. They go through life thinking about it. Maybe one day they wake up and it's sunshine and daisies. And everything's great, and they turn around and they see the hand of God and everything, and they're like, Hashem, God, you're here with me. This is incredible. I see you in my life. I see you guiding me. I see you leading me. I can feel your presence. I experience a personal act of divine providence. I could feel maybe even a miracle. I don't know what. It's like, you know what? Today, there's God. Tomorrow, doom and gloom. You wake up on the wrong side of the bed, right? Somebody stole your phone. You can't even call the police to report it. Okay, right? You get in a car accident on the way to work. Your boss comes in, yells at you. You get home and your dog rips up your favorite TV slippers. And then they don't show Matlock. This is like the worst day ever. This is the worst day ever. And you just think, you know what, there is no God. And then, of course, that cycle returns someday, yes, they know. And so, where do they fit into this paradigm? Do they have a place in the world to come only half the time? Like, do they get half a world to come? Right? A vacation home? Right? Do they get a vacation world to come? It's like, you get to visit it on the weekends, Moishi. You know, how does this work? Where does this person fit? And then the supplemental question, which is, and Rabbi, how do we even know there's a God? Because if there is a God, I'd like to know and be part of this category, the first category that believes in God, so I have this place in the world to come. I'm not against it. I'm not fighting you. You know, they talk about the prayer of the agnostic. You know, an atheist is a person who says there is no God. I always like to tell people, an atheist really isn't somebody who says there is no God because you can't prove it or disprove it. Really, an atheist is a belief too. I believe there's no God. People don't think about it so often, but atheism is a faith. A believer has faith that there's God. What does an atheist have faith in? That there's no God. So I love it. I always try to explain to people, you got your faith too. You can't prove to me there's no God. So you just have faith. Okay, so you're a believer too. You're a believer. You're just a believer that there's no God. Okay? That's an atheist, and then you have a theist, a person who believes there's a God, and then you have a person in the middle, an agnostic. And there's actually a prayer. I don't know who wrote this prayer, but it's a great prayer. It's the prayer for the agnostic. So remember this one, Sabrina, when you know. I'm not saying you're agnostic, but I'm saying your okay. But your questions, and I think to a certain extent, all of us living in the modern world where we're surrounded by a great deal of either outright atheism or just very, very loosey-goosey religion, very watered down. I think it's a very natural place for all of us to feel like we are agnostics. We're not fighting God. We just don't know. And it's like, we'd like to find out. We'd love God. Wouldn't you love it if God just like did something and he'd be like, I'm here, Sabrina. Right? Wouldn't you love that? Wouldn't you love that? I'm going to tell you later why it wouldn't. I'm going to tell you later why it wouldn't make a difference. But we'll get to that. We all think it'll make a difference. It doesn't. But to a certain extent, we all have a piece of ourselves. You know, there's that's agnostic or doesn't know or has doubts. You know, there's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos in the Ethics of the Fathers, a very, very fascinating Mishnah, one of my favorites. It says, Da ma lahashiv la Epikuros. Know how to answer an Epicurean. An Epikuros is typically a person who doesn't believe in God. We'll just call him an atheist. Know how to answer their questions. So that means to say there's a religious obligation on a Jewish person that they should know how to answer people who disagree with our beliefs. And the deeper commentaries say, and every one of us has a little bit of an Epikuros inside. It's not just about answering the non-believer on the outside, it's also about answering the non-believer on the inside. We all have a little bit of an Epikuros inside of us. So we need to know how to answer that little man or woman inside of us as well. And we're going to attempt to do that today. So those are the two questions that Sabrina very poignantly asked about the last class. Number one, where does the person who's not sure if there's a God or there's not a God, where do they fit into this paradigm? And number two, how do we in fact know that there is a God? Are these good questions? Okay. I think these are very, very important, very good. So let's get into it. Okay. So, you know, when we're trying to figure out whether there is or is not a God, we always come to the word emunah. What does emunah mean? We have some Israelis in the room. Emunah means faith. Are you Israeli? You just know what emunah means. Okay, you know what the word emunah means. Emunah means faith. Now, if I were to ask you, what does faith mean, what would you say? Raise your hand if you have an idea what does faith mean. Belief without reason. How many of you agree with that definition? Basically, anybody else have a different interpretation of what emunah means? Faith? What's that? Confidence that there's a God, perhaps. Okay. So when I think about the word emunah, faith, it connotes something that you don't know, but you believe in it. Because if I did know it, I wouldn't have to have faith. Okay, is that clear? In other words, faith is almost the opposite of knowledge. Knowledge is something I know. Faith is something I don't know, but I believe in it. Now, here's the problem. All right, let's hear this question. This is very important. If I can't prove that there's a God, then why believe? And if it is, in fact, knowledge, and in fact, I can know it for certain, why is it called faith? This is a very, very important question. If I can't know it, and it's all based on faith, then why believe? I don't believe that there are magical little trolls roaming around watching all my deeds. Oh, he spoke another piece of gossip. Hee hee! His hair turns red. Okay? I don't believe in magical little trolls running around. Okay? Albert, my redheaded friend over there, is frowning. Okay? You're not a troll, Albert. You're many things, but you're not a troll. There are no trolls over 6 feet tall. If I can't prove it, then why believe it? I mean, is God just like, Aesop's fable? And if I can know it, then why call it faith? Either way you go, you are struck. Now, we explained last time that in reality there is no Hebrew word for faith, which means belief, because the Torah says that knowing God is actually knowable. You can know it. He gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai. He did the 10 plagues. He split the sea for us. He's like, here I am. He had the Sabrina moment. That's that moment that we all want, where God just comes down and is like, bada bing, bada boom, here I am. We had that as a nation. So we have that knowledge. So what does emunah mean? It doesn't really mean faith. What does it mean? We said last time faithfulness. Emunah means to be faithful to that which you know. You're married. You know that you are married and you made a commitment to that person, that man, that woman. Can I be faithful? Can I act upon that knowledge? Can I make sure to be sacred to that relationship and not bring anyone else into that sacred relationship? Can I make sure to keep that relationship holy? That's called acting on that which you know. So really the word emunah means faithful. We said last time, Moses, the great Moses, he's called B'chol Beisi Ne'emanu. In my whole house, he is faithful. And of course, it can't mean faith, because did Moses have faith in God? Do I have faith in someone I'm speaking to? Moses is speaking to God all the time. It's no sense to say that Moshe had faith in God. He spoke to him. He's like Norm and that other guy on Cheers. Right? They're sitting across in the bar. They're schmoozing. I don't have faith that Norm exists. I speak to Norm every day. Okay? That's Moshe and God. That's like Norm on Cheers. Okay? So what does it mean that Moshe was filled with the greatest faith? Not belief, but he was faithful. That means he knew that there was a God, he knew what God expected, and he did it. That's what it means. So emunah doesn't really mean faith, because in Judaism we actually have knowledge. It really means to be faithful to that knowledge. But the question is, if we translate faith, if we translate emunah as faith, there's got to be some truth to that too. I asked you, what does emunah mean? And nobody said faithful. You all said faith. Which means that even though I'm telling you right now you're wrong, doesn't matter. The fact that colloquially, the fact that we all call it faith means that there has to be some truth to that. There has to be some truth to the fact that even though I'm telling you it's knowledge, there is an element of faith to it. So what does that mean? Let's explore that a little bit. So there's 2 ways that a person could come to prove God. One we'd call a proof of derivation, and the other we'd call it a proof from, anybody know the opposite? Proof from derivation, and the other is a proof from exclusion. Who can give me an example of proof from derivation? Anybody know a proof from derivation? Well, it comes from the word to derive. So give me an example of something you could derive. What? Through nature, maybe, yeah. Not about God. I'm talking about, are you talking about God? Well, I want you to give me something that you can derive at. Give me a classic, because God, we're talking about a really highfalutin big thing. Yeah. Okay, so let me hold that for a minute. That's super important, and I very much want to hear how you arrived that there was a God. But I want to first establish the context that we're dealing with. Proof from derivation. You see a person holding an apple. And what happens to the apple when he lets go? It falls. And what can you derive from that? Gravity. Okay? What? Sir Isaac Newton. You can derive that there is gravity. Apple here, up in the air, apple there, down on the ground. I have derived by experimentation that there is a thing in this world that's pulling the apple down. The apple's up here, and now it's on the ground. I have proved to you that there is gravity. That's called proof through derivation. Then there's another kind of proof. That's not a proof through derivation, it's a proof through exclusion, which means that I've exhausted all other possibilities, and so it must be that this is the right answer. It can't be X, it can't be Y, it can't be Z. You know what the answer has to be? What? A, B, whatever it is. So that's proof through exclusion. So when a person tries to understand if there's a God or not, you're going to look at both ways of trying to prove something. Number one, a proof through derivation, which is the best because I can prove it, like Sir Isaac Newton does with gravity. And the second is a proof through exclusion, where I've tried to see if any other answer could answer it, and it does not, so therefore I know it must be something else. It must be whatever is left over. So if I wanted to prove God from proof of derivation, right? How do you think I could do that? How could I come across that? So one obviously is miracle. One way of having proof through derivation is a miracle. And that is filled in the Torah. You have in the Torah many examples of miracles, splitting of the sea, the 10 plagues, the burning bush. What? Okay, birth is a miracle. I'm not denying it. All the women are going to yell at me, and I'm going to get in trouble when I get home. 5 times I had a miracle for you. You don't dare call it. Okay, I'm not saying it's not. Okay.
The preacher from the south.
Right. Okay. She suddenly turned into an Alabama preacher woman. Okay, miracles are a classic proof from derivation. Right? We have the laws of nature. Gravity tells me that water should flow to the lowest point, and then you have the splitting of the sea, where the waters in the sea stand up like walls. Sir Isaac Newton would have been flummoxed. What in the world happened to this water? It should be flowing to the lowest point, and yet it does not. Okay, that is a miracle. That's a miracle. That's one way to know God. But of course, we live in an era where there are no miracles, not any revealed miracle. God's face is hidden. Miracles also are hidden. By the way, what do we read on Purim? What book do we read on the Jewish holiday of Purim? The Megillah Esther. Now, the Megillah of Esther happens after the destruction of the first temple. During the first temple time, there were 10 daily miracles that happened all the time. You see, God's face is very clear to us. And then the temple gets destroyed. The Jews get exiled out to Babylonia. We get that great song from Bob Marley, right? Nobody knows? By the Rivers of Babylon. Oh, now don't smile. Okay? We get that great Bob Marley song, Because We Were Exiled. And the Jews are sitting there forlorn and saddened and depressed because God had left them. And instead of God's face being revealed, God's face is now hidden. It's not that God doesn't do miracles anymore, but instead of open miracles, where the laws of nature are shattered, like the 10 plagues or splitting of the sea or Mount Sinai, we now have hidden miracles, where God intervenes in our lives in a hidden way, where you can tell that God's there with you. You can feel it, you can experience it, but you have to have sensitive eyes. It's not an open miracle, it's a hidden miracle. So interestingly enough, the name of the book, when the Jews are first experiencing that God's face is hidden, is the Megillah of Esther. And it's also the only book where God's name is not. Every other book in the Torah has God's name in it. The book of Esther, not there. And if you translate the word Megillat Esther, which literally means the scroll of Esther, but if you translate it literally, we have any Israelis in the room? Let's go back to our Israelis. Megillah means a scroll, but what does the word legalot mean? To reveal. What does Esther mean, or seter, nistar, to reveal that which is hidden. In other words, Megillat Esther is the revealing of God's face, which I'm living in a new dimension now, a new period of time. God's face isn't open as it used to be when the temple was. Now I'm living in the time of Gilui Nistar, Megillat Esther, the revelation of the hidden. God's still there, but in a hidden way. But the greatest way to reveal God's presence through proof through derivation would be if I had a miracle. We don't have that anymore. Now we do have a tradition, we have a Masorah that tells us about the miracles, and that's good enough for us as well. But that's proof through derivation. Now the early commentators also talk about the concept that you could come to God through the second place, and that's through proof of exclusion. And they write that there is a correct, they write over here, a correct examination of the world will yield finding God. If you look into the world well enough, you will find God. The famous 11th century minister William Paley talks about the famous example of the watch in the desert. How many of you heard of the watch in the desert? No. Do you guys travel a lot? You guys go to the desert? You ever seen a watch in a desert? That's his point. He says, what would happen if you found a watch in a desert? Would you imagine that it just got there over time? The sands of time collided enough times, and then a rock came in, and then a little shard of diamond. Suddenly you got an atomic clock. And by the way, on the side it read SWAT. Right? Only the finest of watches. Rolex, you know. I'm charging you more money for the next class now that I know that. And so, of course, William Paley writes, if you found that watch in the desert and somebody argued to, nobody made it, it's just that it developed over time, millennia, epochs of history, and it just sort of developed on its own through natural causes. You'd look at the person and scoff. And yet we have a much more complex ecosystem, a much more complex world. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And we look at it and we say it may have just happened by accident, just may have just evolved over billions of years. And so that is William Paley's famous example of the watch in the desert. You know, Fred Hoyer, by the way, who was the person who coined the term Big Bang, he writes that the creation of even one enzyme is less likely than a tornado going through a junkyard and creating a 747 airplane. And yet, people will believe that's what happened. If you saw a 747, you'd never say, you know what, I happen to be in Joplin, Missouri. You know Joplin, that's like everything bad happened. Okay, Joplin, Missouri, right? Okay, there we go. I was in Joplin and this tornado came through and it picked up the cars and it picked up the junk. And amazingly, a 747 working engine, perfect, El Al, came out on the... Again, you would laugh at that. And so this is what you would call proof through exclusion. You know, King David, when he writes in Tehillim, he doesn't write in a scientific way, but what he writes is, Hashamayim misaprim kvodo, umasa yadav magidar akia. If I look up at the sky, I can see God. And the work of his hands, the sky reveals. What he was saying is that even without miracles, if I examine the world with a sensitive heart, I will see that there is God. I want to read to you an incredible quote in the Chazon Ish. This was written by the greatest sage in the beginning of the 20th century, lived in pre-British Mandate Palestine. The Chazon Ish, who lived in a little rickety town called Bnei Brak, with dirt roads, plenty of donkey, and a few Jews as well. And the Chazon Ish wrote this incredible work on faith called the Chazon Ish. Now, by the way, lest you think that his name was the Chazon Ish, his name was actually Rabbi Shaya Karelitz, but oftentimes, as what happens with Jewish authors, their names become the work that they write, right? So, for example, the Chafetz Chaim, people think like his mother gave birth, and she said, what should I call him? How about Chafetz Chaim, lover of life? I mean, it's a great name. It's like the Indian name, blowing leaf, okay? I'll call him lover of life. Okay, that's not what happened. He had a name as well. But he wrote this incredible book on Lashon Hara, evil speech, called the Chafetz Chaim, Who Loves Life, and that's, of course, became the way that we refer to this great rabbi. Listen to the way that the Chazon Ish describes the characteristic of faith. Very, very beautiful poetic Hebrew. You need a dictionary for it, even if you're Israeli, okay? Listen to what he writes here. Midas emuna, the nature of faith, hi netia daka miadinut hanefesh. I can't even do justice to how beautiful and poetic these words are. But this is what he writes. The character trait of faith is a slight turning in the sensitivity of the soul. Very beautiful. It's a slight turning of the sensitivity of the im ha'adam hu bal nefesh. If a person is a bal nefesh, which is hard to translate, but what he means to say is a person who makes his soul primary to his body. He's spiritually minded. V'shato shat hashket. And it's a moment of peace and quiet. Chavshi mirevon tavani. Free from all lust and desire. Ve'eno marhiva mimachazeh shamayim l'ram. And his eyes are filled with the wonder of this world, the sky, va'aretz la'omek, the width and the breadth of the land. Hu nirgash v'nit. He is incredibly moved and filled with emotion. And he goes on and on and on. But what the Chazon Ish is writing is that if a person has their spiritual antenna up, and it's a time of quiet where you're not bribed by the desires of your soul. You see, because when we are bribed by the desires of our soul for good food, may not be kosher, to be able to do something on a Saturday, which might not be allowed, to be able to look or do something with someone of the opposite sex, which we want to and we shouldn't. When we're filled with those desires, we can't think straight. We even call people that are in love, what do they call them? Like, don't we call them crazy in love? Right? There's a reason. You know why? Because they're mashuga. when you're in love, you're not thinking straight. You don't think so? You think you're thinking straight? How long have you been married?
This time around?
Yeah. This time around.
7 years.
So here's what I can tell you. The love that you experience right now, that you can think straight with, because that's real love. But the love which is not real love, which is when you're dating, okay? And you're more infatuated, right? You're more filled with infatuation or lust, right? Again, not necessarily in a bad way. There's a purpose for that. It gets you to the point you're at now. You're not actually at the love state. You can't. How can you love somebody until you're in the home and she needs you to pick up your dirty underwear, okay?
Psychological growth.
Yeah.
Is that found reason not is
Right.
people out one cannot.
Right. Okay, that's very good. In other words, until you're actually married and you have to expand yourself for that person, and that deals with the good and the bad and the ugly. See, when you're dating, all you see is the good. No, Marty, I don't know what's going on here, buddy.
Everything you say.
Yeah.
Worship dating.
Uh-huh.
And much.
Well, so first of all, okay, so I don't want to do a whole class on marriage here.
I know. I'm just saying.
But in Jewish law, according to many opinions, once you're living together, you're married. So we're not going to get into the technicals. So why do you have a chuppah and all that kind of stuff, and why do we get around? But technically, one of the ways that you can actually get married is by living together. But the point is, once you start living together, you start seeing the other person's foibles. You start seeing issues start coming up, and you have to decide how much am I going to expand of myself in order to accommodate this other person. That's love. The other stuff, love is blind. Okay, all right. You're not crazy. You're just blind.
It has to be that one.
To get you there, what would make you jump?
Nobody will be married.
Right.
I'm serious. You see
That's
that
right.
sort of person
That's
who's
right.
there?
That's right.
Gone.
That's right. So, so when a person is filled with blindness, whether it's through love or blindness because they're corrupted by power or they want to be wealthy and that's all they can think about, they're not thinking straight. What the Chazon Ish is saying, if you have a moment of complete quiet of the soul, where your soul's interest in all sorts of worldly matters is quiet for that moment. You're not bribed by all that goes around you. What he writes is that the sensitive spiritual soul will start to see God in that moment of quiet, which means to say, you don't so much need to go on this journey of discovery of God as much as you need to have moments of quiet introspection. If a person allows themselves, you ever do this where we're always so busy, we're on our phones, we're on our tablets, we got all of our devices, and we can't think at all because there's so much going on around us. And then you go somewhere where you have no reception and everything's clear. Ah, right? The lines are not clear, I can't get reception, but suddenly start having these deep and meaningful conversations with the person I'm in the car with as I'm walking or driving through Kalamazoo or whatever small city I'm in. Okay, I start getting clarity. I start asking these deep, penetrating questions. Or you can do this when you go on a hike. If you ever go on a hike, you start having all these deep thoughts, right? Or on Shabbos, if you turn off your devices on Shabbat, start having all these very deep and philosophical, complex thoughts inside of you. Because basically, we have a thing called a soul, otherwise known as a GPS, a God positioning system. And most of the time, our soul is so covered by all sorts of things which distract us that we can't even hear it. But the moment you take everything off, the moment you have a moment to breathe and to think clearly, suddenly your soul starts emanating. You start feeling it. That's not scientific, but it's reality. It's something you can experience for yourself. When you have a moment of quiet, things start getting very clear. Your soul starts emanating. Yeah.
When they mapped, they found that they were God.
Yeah.
The transgene did a study on it and said the gene more active in a rabbi than it was in an atheist.
I knew that's why my head was
doing-
hurting. Okay. All the time, I've got too much God genes. Levi's genes and...
Should be everybody's.
That is very interesting. So that's called proof from exclusion when we look into this world. Let me give you a little bit. I don't want to focus too much on science, but for the modern mind, we can't avoid science when we're thinking about God. We're just too used to it. That's the way we see life now. Science, for most of us, represents reality at this point. So I think it's important to discuss that a little bit. So, in 1966, Time magazine came out with a cover article called "Is God Dead?" How many of you remember that time when? Yeah, you remember that season? Okay, but you remember the "Is God Dead?" It was on the cover of Time.
Oh, sure.
You remember that? Okay. So many people had accepted the cultural narrative that God was obsolete, and as science progressed, you really didn't need God. In that same year in 1966, Carl Sagan, right, world-renowned astronomer, he said that there were two necessary criteria for a planet to support life. Two things you would need. Number one, the right kind of star. Number two, a planet the right distance from that star. So those were the two things that you needed to create a life-sustaining planet. Now, this was very exciting in 1966. Let me explain to you why. Based on those calculations, that to have a life-sustaining planet, you only need two criteria. So they basically figured out, right, that with 1 octillion planets, okay, that's a 1 with 24 zeros after it, there should be 1 septillion planets that have life on them. In other words, 1 followed by 20 zeros. Okay, 1 septillion worlds, Earths, since you only need 2 criteria to create this kind of a world. Now, SETI, which was the search for extraterrestrial life, got very popular at that point in time. Because if you have 1 septillion Earths, there's got to be E.T. somewhere, and we all love E.T., okay? We all love E.T., we all love that green cartoon guy, what's his name? With the little thing on his head? Martian. What's his name? Marvin. We all love Marvin. We love E.T. We want to meet him. We want to do FaceTime with E.T. and Marvin. So SETI gets really, really big. Then everyone's looking for that. They put out these radio telescopic signals, waiting to hear a message back from E.T. or Marvin. And by 2014, how many hits had they gotten on these receptors? Take a wild guess. 0. Which was completely confusing to the scientists because based on their calculations, there should be a septillion number of planets out there with life-sustaining Earth. So, of course, we learned later on that Carl Sagan was wrong. The world does not have just 2 criteria, it actually had 10. And then they realized it actually had 20. And then it went up to 50 criteria to support a life-sustaining planet. And the number of life-sustaining planets dropped to the thousands and kept dropping. Now we know that there are over 200 necessary parameters to create a life-sustaining planet. Over 200, and that's just what we know now. It's going to keep growing. Let me give you one incredible example that I shared with my good buddy Albert today during our lunch and learn. Did you know if the Earth did not have a Jupiter, which is this incredibly gravity-rich planet, which all the asteroids that come in, it pulls away from Earth. Earth would be just a giant dartboard. If we didn't have Jupiter, we couldn't be here today. See? Next time you see Jupiter, say thank you. Okay? Thank you, Jupiter. So that's just literally one of over 200 criteria that you need to have a life-sustaining planet. So we have a big question which we need to ask ourselves, which is this all by accident? Doesn't believing in God require less faith than believing that we accidentally beat the unconquerable odds? That's a question we have to ask ourselves. That's called proof through derivation. I'm not doing anything but looking at the way the world is created. Fred Hoyle, who we mentioned earlier, what? Oh, proof through exclusion. I'm sorry, I said derivation, proof through exclusion. So Fred Hoyle, who is famous for coining the Big Bang, he wrote, "My atheism was greatly shaken by these developments." Because it's very hard when you see how many characteristics are needed to be able to say that this all happened by accident. Paul Davies, how many of you have heard of Paul Davies? Very, very famous theoretical physicist. He wrote, "The appearance of design is overwhelming. And if there's a design, there's a designer." And Christopher Hitchens, if anybody has read Christopher Hitchens, part of the New Atheism movement, he has a book in my trunk, God is Not Great. I leave it in the trunk, okay? I leave it in the trunk. But I do read Hitchens. And Christopher Hitchens wrote that, without question, the fine-tuning argument, which is the argument we're talking about now that the world is so perfect and looks by design, he writes, the fine-tuning argument was the most powerful argument of the other side. So this argument, the fine-tuning argument, the fact the world is so perfect, is the most powerful argument from a scientific level. And Oh, the Japanese one.
Yeah.
Right. So he had a whole thing. Right. That was very interesting. Yeah, I saw that article. That was very interesting. And finally, John Lennox, who I like a lot, who is an Oxford University professor of mathematics. You may have seen him. He actually debates Christopher Hitchens sometimes. And John Lennox wrote, "The more that we know about our universe, the more that the hypothesis that there is a creator gains in credibility as the best explanation of why we are here." So the more that you look simply at the world, the more that you can tell that it is there's a creator. There's somebody who started this all. If that wasn't clear enough, let me put it in a different way. One of my favorite philosophers, Thomas Aquinas, 13th century theologian, philosopher, he made a very simple observation. What was Thomas Aquinas' observation? Things move. He wasn't the brightest chap. No, okay. Okay, Thomas Aquinas, he says things move, and he also observed that things don't move without a cause. Now, these were two very simple observations with incredibly powerful ramification. Number one, matter moves. Number two, something always causes the matter to move. Now, what that means, based on this observation, there has to be a beginner to cause the world to move, because nothing moves on its own. There has to be an unmoved mover to begin all motion, a first domino to start knocking down all the rest of the dominoes. Do you hear this? Do you understand this? This is so important. So now science will never discover the first cause of what started everything. So you have to understand, all of science comes from creation and on, from the Big Bang and on. That's when all the laws of nature develop and all of that. What's before that? If you ask scientists, they'll say that's an unscientific question. And they're right, because science can only deal with what is here. Even in the Talmud, it's very interesting, in Chagiga, it says you're not really supposed to ask what happened. Like, it's a realm of understanding that we just don't understand. But certainly in science, they would say, if you ask the question, what happened before the Big Bang, they would say that's an unscientific question. That's more philosophical, theological. It's not scientific. And that's fine. Science will never discover the first cause, and that's not a knock on science. It's just that the first cause lies outside of the realm of science. And that's okay. That's perfectly fine. But something has to come from something. We know that. Something has to come from something. Something can't come from nothing. That's the first law of thermodynamics. Something can't come from nothing. It's a very easy law to remember. It almost sounds ghetto. Something can't come from nothing. It's the first law of thermodynamics. So, okay, now what's the obvious objection to this? The obvious objection is, well, maybe maybe the world is infinite. And if the world's infinite, you don't need a beginner, a person to cause all of it. But what's the problem? All scientists now believe that there was a beginning. They call it the Big Bang. And if there's a Big Bang, guess what there also is? A Big Banger. Okay? That's like if you're really ghetto, you're a Big Banger. Okay? So if there is a Big Bang, we know that there's a Big Banger. So who is that? That is the question. So if the universe had a beginning, then something had to start it. Do you see this? There has to be a beginning. Now maybe you'll argue that, maybe there's a multiverse. See, maybe it's true our universe had a beginning, but maybe there's other universes out. And our universe got created from another universe. But what's the problem again? Where did that universe begin? And you just go back and back until you find that there has to be a beginner. Let me just add one more thing. This isn't a science class, although it sort of is today. I didn't plan. Okay. Let me explain it. One last piece, and then we'll get back to the Torah hour. Okay? Okay. So, before the world existed, was there time or not? Who said no? How do you know there was no time? But it existed in time. Was there time before the world existed?
No.
Who says yes? Marty, how was there time? Okay, because he will be? Okay, we'll get into that a little bit. By the way, you know how there was no time? Come on, guys, 12th grade science here.
There was no clock.
Einstein, there was no clock.
It was in the desert, Isaac.
That's right, it was in the desert. Thank you, Marty, for listening.
Time.
Okay, so time is not a human concept. Even nowadays, by the way, when we measure time, we're not basing it even on astrological phenomena. We're basing it on the atomic oscillation, right? The atomic clock. It's real. Time is real. Time is real. But one thing we know about time, and this comes from Einstein's general theory of relativity, is that what? Time is relative to matter. In other words, time only exists when there is matter. It's how we I can't think of the right word. How we basically explain matter moving through space. That happens within time. But what happens if I have no matter or space? Then there is no time. Even, by the way, how many of you have heard of the famous experiment where they took a clock up in space? I guess it's not so famous. Okay. Okay. And what happened to the clock? It slowed down. How does that happen? Right, we can't even wrap our minds around that because we're like, what in the world? A second's a second, an hour's an hour. But it's not. Time isn't constant. It's relative to the speed of mass and matter all around you. In other words, time is different in space as it is here. Time is connected to an earth and matter. But if there was no matter, then guess what there also wasn't? Time. That means, and if we know that there was a beginning to the universe, what didn't exist before the universe? Time, which means that there's no time for something else to create it. What time? It's not time.
Matter.
Earth, something physical.
Tohu wasn't.
Tohu was. That's part of the creation of the world. It just wasn't in its concrete form. It was mushy. It was evolving. Right? Tohuvo, that the world was in this chaotic state. But the point is, if we know that there's a beginning, you can't say that something else earlier than that created it, because there was no earlier, because there was no time. Which means to say that there has to be something independent that exists outside of time, which brought something into time. We call that God. So again, this is a really superficial understanding of very deep scientific ideas, but it's important for us to know, because we live in a scientific universe, and we have modern minds, modern Western minds, and if we don't ever deal with the science behind it, we won't really understand. But what I'm trying to say, we'll get to in just a second, is that if you look at the world, even scientifically, you'll see that you'll come to a Big Banger. You'll come to something, God, that created everything else. You have to. One time I was sitting with an atheist in a Starbucks. It's not a joke. Okay? A rabbi walked into a Starbucks with an atheist. And we were talking about, is there a God? And there's not. He's like, I don't believe in God, blah, 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 blah. And I said, okay. I said, but, and we spoke about some of these scientific ideas. And I said, you have to understand, for me, it's very logical. The world had a beginning, so something outside of time, God created it. Makes perfect sense. For you have to have faith. You've got to have faith that somehow down the road, science will discover how something outside of time, which wasn't God, created time, created Earth. You have no clue what that is. Science doesn't even have any clue of a beginning to that answer, but you have faith that science will eventually discover how that's possible. And he agreed with me, because it makes perfect sense. He said, I don't have the answer. He's like, yeah, well, okay, I guess science will eventually discover it. But it's important to know then that the person who doesn't believe in God has to have incredible faith. Incredible faith. So you have to decide at this point which faith is more reasonable. Is it more reasonable to say that something came from nothing, or that something came from something, i.e. God? To me, that's much more reasonable. That requires much less faith. Now, that's called proof from derivation. So I actually see the hour's late, so I'm going to hold questions just for now, because I want to... You have a really good one?
Forget it. But
Okay. Yeah, tell me quickly. Just because I want to get to a few other ideas.
Okay, this is more of a comment.
Yes.
We did not, quote unquote, not.
Right.
I've always.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
science,
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
not,
Right.
It didn't matter.
Right. But that is exactly what the Chazon Ish writes. The Chazon Ish writes, it doesn't matter how obvious it is. If it's not a moment of quiet, and it's not a moment where you have a spiritual sensitivity to be, yeah, right. 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 Fully get it. Well, but what I would argue is everybody in their lifetimes has God moment, and the question is just how open are you to experiencing those moments and then reflecting on those. Everybody has
time you are, and if you're not, you won't.
Okay, well that's true, but that's a character. That's a character thing.
Yeah, well it is. I mean,
So,
it's just, you
yeah.
talk to sugar about the science. I know how
Right.
to know these.
Right.
And it,
Okay.
and it's a miracle.
Please disregard 57. No, 06. No, okay.
But I wouldn't have necessarily. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know what that's about.
Right.
I know to get there, and.
But that's
I saw
why.
that
But that's
come out,
but
you
that's
know?
why the Chazon Ish is writing. If you're a Baal Nefesh, if you have spiritual sensitivity, and that's a character. That's something you develop in your character to be able to notice those things. But listen, two people can experience the same thing. One person can say, "I saw God in that," and the other person can say, "Completely random." You have to have spiritual and to see it. Now that doesn't make it less real. It just means to say it's a certain sensitivity. If I've got my radio tuned properly, I can get a lot more station. That's just the reality.
That really provides that access.
For women going on the Israel trip, that is true.
Going in November, the spots.
Right, very good, very good. So let's just get back to this for a moment. So, and by the way, I would add one more thing. We said one way to know God is through miracles. Another way to know God is through what we call this proof from derivation. It's not a proof through exclusion. I can't prove God, but I've tried every other example, a reasonable example, and they don't work. So it must be that original beginner, which we call God. There's also a third one, which I'd like to throw, and that's called being godly. What I mean by that, and I've seen this in my own life, and other people have experienced it in their lives as well, which is the more that a person works on getting close to God, the more they sense God in their life. Now, I'm completely aware that a psychologist would come into this room and say, well, of course, if you're trying to connect to this being that you've created a figment of your imagination, of course it will become more real over time. I'm not denying that such a thing is true, except for the fact that you can experience it on your own and know that it's real. So the more that a person tries to get closer to God, the more that a person tries to connect to Torah and do what's right, the more that you sense God. That's not scientific. I'm just telling you it's a reality you can experience for yourself, and you can decide for yourself if you're living in a delusional reality or whether it's something that is true. I can only tell you my experience, and it certainly was not certainly did not feel like a delusion. So let's go back to the faith. Let's go back to, if we can know that there's a God because of our Masorah, because of our tradition that there is a God, and because of proof through exclusion, that I look at all the other explanations of how the world came into being and they don't work, so it must be God, and we reach out to God and that gets us closer to God. How can we call it faith? It's really quite reasonable, quite rational. And so here's the answer. Because our faith comes from proof through exclusion, not proof through deduction, there's always a little gap. Do you hear this? This is so important. Listen to this idea, folks. If you don't remember anything from my class, remember this one idea. Because our knowledge of God does not come from proof from derivation, like gravity does. How many of you struggle with gravity? Like you wake up and you're like, I just don't know. Isaac Newton, he was great and all, but I just don't know. Okay, we don't struggle with that because proof through derivation. Also, we have no reason not to. Of course, we have fantasies of flying, but okay. Because we experience God through proof from exclusion, right? Unless, of course, you've experienced God, that's a little different. But from at least a mental perspective, we understand God cerebrally through proof through exclusion. No other answer seems rational. There's always going to be a gap when it comes to performing godly acts when we don't want. There's always enough space and enough doubt because I can't derive it. It's not like gravity. There's always a gap. And that gap is where all the carnage happens. That little gap, because we can only prove it through exclusion, allows us to have what the Talmud calls ruach shtus. The Talmud says, Ein adam chote el im ken nichnas bo ruach shtus. A person cannot sin unless a spirit of foolishness enters their bodies. It's like a takeover from a demon. Right? What do they have? One of those movies where you're a possession. You get possessed by this ruach shtus, this crazy talk, this crazy thought. And you start saying, well, I really want to do XYZ, loves. Okay? Maybe there's no God. It's always ironic that always when you want to do what you don't want to do, that's when suddenly you're not sure if there's God. It is a unique coincidence. But that's that gap. Because we don't know God through derivation, we only know it through exclusion, it allows a small enough little gap to appear that you can start thinking crazy talk, crazy thoughts, and allow yourself to do and rationalize doing what you want to do. Yeah. Well, that is also free will. And the reason, by the way, that's the answer to the question, why would God make it that we have to come to God's knowledge through exclusion rather than derivation? And that is the answer, in order to allow for free will. If we could derive that there was a God, the same way that we could derive that there was gravity, we would have no free will at that. There's no way we could rebel against God. There's no way we could decide not to do what God wanted. There's no way. There's no way. So what does God do? What God does is he makes sure that we have a little gap, and that little gap is what's created by having proof through exclusion rather than proof through derivation. That's what creates free will. Fascinating. Is this interesting? That is where free will comes from, that little sliver. Now, the test of intellectual greatness is how doggedly you go about trying to discover truth. That's the test of intellectual greatness, how doggedly you go about trying to discover truth. But that's not as important as the second half, and that is the measure of character greatness. And you know what the measure of character greatness is? How loyal you are to what you actually. A lot of us know things, but don't do them. A lot of us know things, but don't do them. The classic example, donuts. Donuts? See, you're a man. You don't fully get it. All the women immediately knew what I was talking about. Okay? Donuts. Do you know when you're on a diet that the donuts are going to go from your mouth to your tush? Do you know immediately that that's going to happen? What? They do. Do you eat them? Why? Because you have a moment of temporary insanity. That is called in the Talmud Ruach Shtus, the spirit of insanity, of foolishness. Even when you know fully well, if only God would come and prove to me that he's here, I would do it. No, you wouldn't. No more than you would keep to your diet. You have no doubts what the donut will do to your thighs, and yet you do it. Knowledge is not what gets us to do things, but a person with great character can stick to their knowledge even in the face of great temptation. That's called free will, and that's called mastering. This is what the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, the Ethics of the Father, says, Ezehu Gibor, who is truly powerful, who is truly mighty, Hakovesh is Yitzro, a person who overcomes their desires. It's not that they don't know, is this really wrong or not? It's that the space between the brain and the heart, the space between our knowledge and our actions is very wide. We can know something for sure, just as I've showed you very clearly, there is a God. I don't believe in it, I know it, and yet it requires incredible diligence and loyalty to be true to that knowledge. It's a measure of our character if we can live up to that which we know. And that small gap in our knowledge, because we know it through exclusion, not derivation, allows for that spirit of craziness to enter our mind when we want to rationalize doing something we shouldn't. Maybe there's no God. But we know God exists just as much as we can know anything else of any significance. And that is free will. So classically in Judaism, the tests that our forefathers went through were not tests of faith. Is there a God or not? They were tests. They knew exactly that there was a God. The test was only, where is the final destination? Abraham is told a test. Lech lecha mi'artzecha, go from your land. He knew there's a God. It's not a test of faith. But what doesn't he know? Where's he going? Go to the land, Asher Areka, that I will show you. He knows there's a God. And he's going to walk on that path. He's got a strong motivation because he knows there's a God. But the test in Judaism is not if there is a God or not, it's just the destination. That is the test of Judaism. Abraham knows there's a God, so he offers his son on the altar. He doesn't know the destination. Is God going to send an angel in to stop him from slaughtering his son or not? That's where the faith is required. That's what we would call the leap of faith. The leap of faith is the small little sliver in our knowledge that allows us to ration. And that little itsy bitsy sliver, you got to leap over. Boing. Okay? We're not talking, really, really big chasm, Grand Canyon style. We're talking flapjack, not slapjack. We're talking, flapjack, thin mint. We're talking, like you go to the Ritz-Carlton, how soft and thin those sheets are. You've got to jump over. That's where the leap. The leap of faith is in that small little area, but you got to leap. That's what we mean when we call it faith. It's knowledge, but because there is that little sliver, which always allows us to rationalize, we do have to jump. Not a big jump. It's a completely rational jump with plenty of motivation because we know he's there, but nevertheless it requires a jump. Where will we end up? What's the purpose of not knowing the destination? Number one, it's a test. But number two, on a deeper idea, and this is so incredible when you think about it, the reason why I can't know the destination, can anybody think about it? Why can't I know the destination? Anybody know? Okay, you're getting there. The result of emunah, the result of faith, is a deeper place that you could have never seen from your very limited place. Imagine for a moment trying to show white light to a person who's stuck in a jail in a glass cell. As much as I want to show him the bright light, I can't. What do I have to do? Break the glass and then he can see. The tests in the Torah are always that by not knowing where you're going to go, it's not just that you don't know where you're going to go because it's a test, but it's also that I'm going to a place that I couldn't even have understood when I was at that spiritual level that I was. And so the test allows me to arrive at a place that I couldn't have even appreciated or understood in my lowly place that I was. So that is the test. So what we've discussed tonight, I know this has been a heady class, and next week we'll actually get into the 13 principles and start dissecting them one by one. I promise no more science. I promise. We're going to get into all 13. It's going to be really interesting. But what we've discussed tonight is the answer to the two questions that we started with. Hopefully we did a good job in answering those two questions. The two questions is, what happens to a person who they're not sure if they believe it or not. We know what happens to the believer, they have a place in the world to come. We know what happens to the not believer, cause and effect, they don't have a place in the world to come. But what happens to someone who's not sure? So what we're saying tonight is that if a person examines this question and really looks openly and honestly without the desire to come to a conclusion that there is no God because of bias, bias. Because if there is no God, there is no judge, I can do whatever I want. But if you look at it openly and honestly, either through our tradition that you can examine and all the miracles that were done, either through proof from exclusion on a scientific level, either through an experiential journey where you come closer to God, and through that experience you feel God through your soul, your GPS, your God positioning system, you will very clearly see what King David wrote, Hashemayim Misaprim Kvodel. The skies reveal the glory of Hashem. You'll understand that he's there. So you have to take that turn, like the Chazon Ish writes, that little tenua, that little movement of a sensitive soul. And if you take that little movement, you'll see that there's a God. But you have to take that little movement. If you sit all day waiting for God to reveal himself, you're going to be in for a sad surprise. He's not going to. That's not the period of history that we're living in. We live in the period of hidden face of God, not in the period of revealed face of God. So what we need to do is what you've all done. Come to a class. Come take a look at this question. Consider it in a moment of quiet, like the Chazon Ish says, which we're doing right now. And in that moment of quiet, we'll have clarity. Our soul, which so often is, distracted by TV and movies and YouTube squirrels that dance and sing, has a moment to reflect and consider. And it will always come to the same conclusion in a moment where our biases are put on the side. Why is it called faith? We can know it because since it's proof through exclusion, not through proof through derivation, there is always a little sliver where a person can rationalize if they want to and say there is no God. And that's what we call faith. So it is at once knowledge and it is at once faith. It is knowledge in the sense that we can know it like anything else, but it is faith in the sense that we can always rationalize to ourselves that there is no God if we want to do something he doesn't allow. And that's the leap. It is knowledge, it is faith. It's both. And the measure of character, we said before, the measure of intellectual greatness, how doggedly we try to discover the truth, which we're doing tonight, and the measure of greatness of character, how loyal we are to that truth now know. Can we be men and women of great character? That's up to you. That's free will. All right, folks, we're going to end it there tonight. Thank you so much for coming. Hope you enjoyed. Next week, we're going to get into the 13 principles. Have a wonderful night.